Hey guys, tonight we're going to uncover one of the most haunting chapters in medieval history. The story that textbooks barely whisper about. The one that makes historians uncomfortable at dinner parties. What really happened to the captured women after Viking raids swept across Europe? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because what you think you know about Viking raids is probably wrong. The Hollywood version gives you bearded warriors swinging axes and sailing into the sunset with treasure chests. But that's not the full story. That's not even half the story. The real story is darker, more complex, and involves lives that were changed forever in ways that most people never consider. Picture this. It's a foggy morning in 793 AD. You're living in a quiet monastery on the coast of Northumbria. The most exciting thing that happens in your village is when Brother Thomas accidentally drops the communion wine. Then you hear it, the sound that would echo through 1,000 nightmares, the scrape of wooden hulls against pebbled beaches, the war cries cutting through morning mist, and suddenly everything you know about your world is about to end. But here's what the sagas don't tell you. Here's what the history books gloss over with clinical language and sanitized summaries. When the smoke cleared and the longships disappeared back into the North Sea, they didn't just take gold and silver. They took people, hundreds of thousands of people over the course of 3 centuries. And among those people were women whose stories have been buried under layers of academic jargon and historical amnesia. Tonight, we're going to change that. We're going to follow their journey from the moment of capture to destinations they never could have imagined. We're going to explore markets where human beings were traded like livestock. We're going to visit households where captives became something between servant and family member. And we're going to uncover archaeological evidence that reveals just how widespread this practice really was. Because this isn't just ancient history. This is the story of how entire populations were displaced, how bloodlines were mixed across continents, and how the genetic map of Europe was rewritten one raid at a time. The DNA flowing through your veins right now might tell a story that began on a Viking longship over 1,000 years ago. The truth is, what happened to captured women after Viking raids was far more complicated than simple slavery. It was a system that created queens and concubines, servants and wives, traders and refugees. Some of these women would die in captivity within months. Others would rise to positions of power that their birth villages never could have offered. And a few would become the mothers of kings. So what really happened when the Vikings came calling? How did a fishing expedition turn into one of history's most efficient human trafficking operations? And why do we know so little about the women who lived through it? Tonight, we're going to find out. Let me start with something that might shock you. The Viking Age wasn't just about raiding. That's the first myth we need to destroy. While Hollywood loves the image of wild-haired warriors burning monasteries for fun, the reality was far more calculated. Viking expeditions were business ventures. They were carefully planned operations with profit margins and supply chains. And human beings were one of their most valuable commodities. Think about it from their perspective. You're a Norse chieftain looking at a map of Europe. You see wealthy monasteries with no military defenses. You see farming communities with surplus grain and livestock. But you also see something else. You see people who can work, people who can be sold, people who represent years of economic value. A single healthy woman could be worth more than a chest of silver coins in the right market. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic economic exploitation on a continental scale. The Vikings had trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. They had established routes, trusted partners, and standardized pricing for different types of captives. Young women commanded premium prices. Children were sold as future investments. Skilled craftsmen were worth their weight in precious metals. But here's where it gets really dark. The Vikings didn't just stumble into the slave trade, they perfected it. They developed techniques for managing large groups of captives during long sea voyages. They created holding facilities at strategic ports. They even had specialized ships designed specifically for human cargo. This was an industry, and like any successful industry, it evolved to maximize efficiency and profit. The numbers are staggering when you really dig into them. Conservative estimates suggest that Viking raids displaced over 500,000 people during the height of their expansion. That's equivalent to emptying a modern city the size of Liverpool or Atlanta. And the majority of those captives were women and children because they were easier to transport and more valuable in distant markets. Now, I need to be clear about something before we go further. This isn't a story about Vikings being uniquely evil. Slavery existed throughout medieval Europe. The Franks enslaved Saxons. The Byzantines enslaved Bulgars. The Islamic caliphates enslaved Christians. What made the Vikings different wasn't their morality. It was their mobility. They could strike anywhere along thousands of miles of coastline, and they could move their human cargo to markets where no one would ever think to look for them. But let's get specific about what actually happened during a typical raid. The longships would beach before dawn. The raiders would move quickly through a settlement, prioritizing targets based on a brutal calculus. The elderly and infirm were often killed immediately because they couldn't travel and had no market value. Adult men were either killed or enslaved depending on their apparent strength and skills. But women and children, they were almost always taken alive. The selection process was methodical. Young women were prized for obvious reasons, but older women with specific skills, healers, weavers, cooks, they had value too. Children over the age of 7 were considered useful because they could work and were easier to train. Infants were usually left behind because they required too much care during transport. Once the selection was made, the captives were bound and marched to the ships. This is where the first wave of mortality occurred. The weak, the injured, those who couldn't keep pace, they were abandoned or killed along the way. The Vikings couldn't afford to slow down their escape for humanitarian concerns. The sea voyage that followed was a nightmare that few modern people can truly comprehend. Imagine being chained in the bottom of a wooden ship. No sanitation, minimal food, constant seasickness, and the very real possibility that a storm could send you to the bottom of the ocean. Many captives died during these voyages, and their bodies were simply thrown overboard. But for those who survived the journey, the real ordeal was just beginning. Because once they reached Viking territories, they entered a complex social and economic system that would determine the rest of their lives. Some would be sold immediately in local markets. Others would be kept as household slaves. A few would be selected for long-distance trade routes that could take them thousands of miles from their original homes. And here's something that most people don't realize. The Vikings weren't the end destination for most of these captives. They were middlemen in a vast international trade network. A woman captured in Ireland might end up in a harem in Baghdad. A girl taken from a Saxon village could find herself in the court of a Byzantine emperor. The Vikings had connections everywhere, and they used those connections to maximize their profits. The archaeological evidence for this trade is overwhelming once you know what to look for. Excavations of Viking trading posts reveal holding pens designed for human cargo. We find shackles and chains in sizes that clearly weren't meant for livestock. We discover coins from across the known world. Payment for transactions that included human beings alongside silver and amber. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from genetics. Modern DNA analysis reveals population mixtures that can only be explained by large-scale human trafficking. Irish genetic markers in Iceland, Slavic DNA in Scandinavia, Saxon bloodlines in Greenland. These aren't random migrations. They're the genetic fingerprints of systematic displacement. The scale of this operation was truly international. Viking traders established permanent outposts along major river systems specifically to facilitate the slave trade. They had partnerships with Arab merchants who could move captives into Middle Eastern markets. They worked with Byzantine officials who needed laborers for massive construction projects. They even sold to other Christian kingdoms who were happy to overlook the source of their new workforce. And the profits were enormous. A single successful raid could net enough human cargo to fund an entire settlement for a year. The wealth generated by this trade helped finance the Viking expansion across the North Atlantic. The same profits that paid for the colonization of Iceland and Greenland came from the systematic exploitation of captured Europeans. But what happened to the women once they reached their final destinations? That's where tonight's story gets really complicated, because the answer depends entirely on where they ended up, who bought them, and what specific skills or attributes they possessed. Some faced lives of grinding servitude that ended in early death. Others found opportunities that their original circumstances never could have provided. The lucky ones, if you can call them that, were purchased by households that treated slaves more like indentured servants. They might eventually earn their freedom, marry into the family, or accumulate enough resources to buy their way out of bondage. The unlucky ones disappeared into brutal labor systems where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. But there was another category entirely that historians struggled to classify. These were the women who ended up in situations that defied the simple slave-free binary. They became concubines to Norse jarls, secondary wives to wealthy merchants, or trusted household managers who wielded significant influence despite their legal status. Their children often grew up free, sometimes even inheriting property and titles. It was a twisted form of social mobility that came at an unimaginable personal cost. Let me tell you about Melkorka, whose story survives in the Laxdæla saga. She was captured during an Irish raid and sold to a wealthy Icelandic settler named Hoskuld. But here's the thing. Melkorka wasn't just any captive. She was the daughter of an Irish king, though she hid her noble birth and pretended to be mute for years. Eventually, she became Hoskuld's concubine and bore him a son who would become one of Iceland's most powerful chieftains. Her story illustrates something crucial about this system. Status wasn't always permanent. A king's daughter could become a slave, but a slave's son could become a king. The Viking world was fluid in ways that the rigid feudal systems of continental Europe weren't. This flexibility created opportunities, but it also meant that survival often depended on wit, beauty, or sheer luck, rather than birth or virtue. Now, let's talk about the markets where these human transactions actually took place, because this wasn't some shadowy underground operation. Slave markets were as public and regulated as any other form of commerce. The largest was probably in Hedeby, a major Viking trading center in what's now northern Germany. Merchants would arrive from across Europe and beyond, inspecting their potential purchases like livestock at a county fair. The process was dehumanizing in ways that are difficult to describe. Captives were stripped, examined for signs of disease or injury, and forced to demonstrate their skills. Could they weave? Could they cook? Could they speak multiple languages? Could they read? Each ability added to their market value. Physical appearance mattered too, but not always in the ways you might expect. Pale skin was prized in southern markets where it signified northern origin. Red hair commanded premium prices in Constantinople because it was considered exotic. But here's something that might surprise you. Not all sales were final. The Viking legal system included provisions for slave redemption. Families could buy back captured relatives if they could raise the necessary funds. Churches sometimes organized collections to free Christian captives from heathen masters. Some captives even managed to negotiate their own freedom by promising future payments or services. The redemption process created its own economy. Professional negotiators specialized in tracking down captives and arranging their release. Monasteries maintained funds specifically for buying back monks and nuns who had been captured during raids. Wealthy families would sometimes bankrupt themselves trying to recover a kidnapped daughter or son. These redemption efforts reveal something important about medieval society's attitude toward captivity. While slavery was accepted as a fact of life, the enslavement of Christians by pagans was seen as a temporary injustice that could and should be corrected. This belief motivated extensive diplomatic and commercial efforts to recover captives, creating a parallel economy built around human redemption. But for every captive who was eventually freed, dozens more vanished into the vast networks of medieval slavery. They ended up on farms in remote Scandinavian valleys, in workshops in bustling trading cities, or in households scattered across the known world. Their stories became family secrets, whispered memories that faded with each passing generation. The psychological impact of this displacement was profound and lasting. Imagine being torn from everything familiar, forced to learn new languages, adapt to foreign customs, and serve masters whose culture you barely understood. Many captives never fully recovered from this trauma. They became permanently displaced persons, belonging neither to their birth culture nor their adopted one. Yet some managed to find ways to preserve their identities even in captivity. They taught their children fragments of their native languages. They maintained religious practices in secret. They passed down stories and songs that kept their original culture alive, even in hostile environments. Archaeological evidence suggests that some slave communities maintained distinct cultural practices for generations. The children of these relationships face their own unique challenges. Were they slaves like their mothers or free like their fathers? The answer varied depending on local laws and customs. In some Viking settlements, the children of slave women inherited their mother's status. In others, they were considered free but of lower social rank. These mixed heritage individuals often became cultural bridges, speaking multiple languages and understanding different traditions. Some of these children rose to remarkable prominence. Olaf the White, who ruled Dublin in the 9th century, was reportedly the son of a captured Irish princess and a Norse king. His dual heritage made him particularly effective at governing both Viking settlers and Irish subjects. Similar examples appear throughout the historical record, suggesting that mixed ancestry could sometimes be an advantage rather than a handicap. But we need to be careful not to romanticize these stories. For every Melkorka who found relative security as a chieftain's concubine, there were countless women who died anonymous deaths in foreign lands. For every child who inherited a throne, there were hundreds who lived and died as slaves. The survivors whose stories made it into the sagas were exceptional precisely because they were exceptions. The trade routes that carried these captives were incredibly sophisticated. Vikings had established what amounted to a human supply chain that connected the remotest corners of Europe with markets in the Middle East and North Africa. A woman captured in Scotland might be transported first to Norway, then to a trading post in the Volga River, then down through Russia to the Black Sea, and finally to Constantinople or even Baghdad. Each leg of this journey involved different traders, different currencies, and different legal systems. The Vikings developed standardized methods for documenting ownership, transferring title, and resolving disputes. They created a bureaucracy of human trafficking that was remarkably efficient for its time. The economic impact of this trade was enormous. Entire regions became economically dependent on slave labor imported through Viking networks. Agricultural production in Iceland was built largely on the backs of Irish and Scottish captives. The great construction projects of the Byzantine Empire relied heavily on Slavic slaves transported down the Dnieper River. Even the early Islamic conquests in Iberia were supported by Christian slaves purchased from Viking traders. But the flow wasn't entirely one way. Vikings also captured and enslaved other Vikings during their frequent internal wars. They raided Slavic territories and sold their captives to Arab merchants, which is actually where the word slave comes from. The term derives from Slav, reflecting the massive numbers of Slavic people who were enslaved during this period. This internal slave trade created complex relationships between Viking communities. A jarl might purchase thralls from a rival who had captured them during a raid on a third party. These slaves might then be used to work land that had itself been conquered from yet another group. The result was a constantly shifting population of displaced people whose origins became increasingly difficult to trace. The religious dimensions of this trade added another layer of complexity. Christian captives were often forced to participate in pagan rituals, while pagan slaves in Christian lands faced pressure to convert. Some captives used religious conversion as a survival strategy, adopting their master's faith in hopes of better treatment. Others maintained their original beliefs in secret, creating underground religious communities that persisted for generations. The treatment of captives varied dramatically depending on their skills, appearance, and the personality of their masters. Some Vikings were known for their relatively humane treatment of slaves, while others were notorious for their cruelty. The sagas contain stories of both kindness and brutality, reflecting the wide range of experiences that captives might face. Women who possessed valuable skills often fared better than those who didn't. A captive who could weave fine cloth, brew ale, or treat illnesses might find herself in a position of relative privilege within a household. These skilled women sometimes became trusted advisors to their masters' wives or even informal household managers responsible for other slaves. But skill alone wasn't enough to guarantee survival. The medieval world was harsh and unpredictable, and slaves were particularly vulnerable to changes in their masters' fortunes. A wealthy household that fell on hard times might sell its slaves to pay debts. A master's death might result in slaves being distributed among his heirs like any other property. Political upheavals could suddenly render valuable skills worthless or dangerous. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia began to change attitudes toward slavery. The process was slow and uneven. Early Christian converts often continued to own slaves while simultaneously funding church construction projects. The church itself sometimes accepted slaves as donations, using their labor to support monasteries and religious foundations. As Christianity spread, new legal and moral frameworks began to emerge around the treatment of captives. The concept of Christian redemption created obligations to free fellow believers from pagan bondage. Church law began to regulate the conditions under which Christians could be enslaved. These changes didn't end slavery, but they began to constrain it in ways that would eventually contribute to its decline. The transformation wasn't immediate, though. For generations, Viking communities maintained dual systems where Christian and pagan practices coexisted uneasily. Some households would attend church on Sundays while still keeping slaves chained in their basements. Others would free their Christian captives but continue to enslave pagans from the Baltic regions. The moral contradictions were stark, but they reflected a society in transition. What's particularly fascinating is how some captive women navigated these changing religious landscapes. They learned to present themselves as devout Christians, to gain favor with newly converted masters. They memorized prayers and psalms, attended religious services, and sometimes even convinced their owners to fund their pilgrimages to holy sites. Religion became both a shield and a weapon in their struggle for survival. But let's talk about something that historians often ignore because it makes them uncomfortable: the sexual exploitation that was endemic to this system. When we discuss Viking captives, we can't pretend that rape and forced concubinage weren't central to their experience. The euphemistic language of medieval sources talking about wives and concubines obscures what was often systematic sexual violence. Young women were specifically targeted during raids not just for their labor value, but for their reproductive capacity. Viking society was polygamous in practice, if not in law, and wealthy men maintained multiple sexual partners regardless of their marital status. Captive women had no legal right to refuse sexual advances from their masters or other free men in the household. The children born from these encounters occupied a strange legal limbo. They weren't quite slaves, but they weren't quite free either. Their status often depended on their father's acknowledgement, which could be given or withdrawn at will. Some grew up alongside their half-siblings from legitimate marriages, while others were treated as expensive property that happened to share their master's blood. These relationships created complex family dynamics that modern people struggle to understand. A captive woman might simultaneously be a sexual partner to the household head, a servant to his legal wife, and a mother to children who outranked her socially. She might wield significant informal influence while having no legal rights whatsoever. It was a system that turned personal relationships into political calculations. The archaeological evidence for these arrangements is subtle but compelling. Excavations of wealthy Viking households reveal separate living quarters that were clearly designed for different classes of women. The main hall housed the legal wife and her children, while smaller buildings provided accommodation for concubines and their offspring. The spatial organization of these sites tells stories that written sources often omit. Genetic analysis has revealed the biological consequences of these arrangements. Studies of medieval cemeteries show that Viking communities had remarkably diverse populations, with maternal lineages that clearly originated from across Europe and beyond. The Y chromosome data tells a different story, showing much more local continuity. This pattern is exactly what you'd expect from a system that imported women while maintaining patriarchal control. But not all captive women remained passive victims of this system. Some found ways to accumulate power and influence despite their legal status. They formed alliances with other household members, gathered information that made them valuable to their masters, or used their cultural knowledge to facilitate trade relationships. A few even managed to establish their own business ventures, trading goods and services that their masters either couldn't or wouldn't provide. The most successful of these women understood that survival required more than just compliance. They needed to make themselves indispensable, not just as laborers or sexual partners, but as cultural brokers who could navigate between different worlds. A captive who spoke multiple languages could serve as a translator. One who understood foreign customs could help negotiate trade agreements. Another, who maintained connections to her homeland, could provide intelligence about potential raid targets. These skills were particularly valuable in the international trading centers where Vikings established permanent settlements. Cities like Dublin, York, and Kiev became cosmopolitan melting pots, where dozens of languages were spoken and multiple currencies were accepted. Captive women who could function in these multilingual environments often found opportunities that pure-born Vikings couldn't access. Some of these women eventually parlayed their cultural knowledge into freedom and prosperity. They established their own trading networks, often specializing in goods from their regions of origin. Irish captives might import fine textiles and religious artifacts. Saxon women could provide access to English silver and manufactured goods. Slavic captives had connections to the fur and amber trades that were so crucial to Viking prosperity. The most remarkable examples involved women who returned to their homelands as wealthy merchants in their own right. After years or decades in captivity, they had accumulated the resources and connections to establish themselves as independent traders. Some even returned to ransom other captives, creating informal networks that helped reunite families torn apart by raiding. But these success stories were exceptional. Most captive women lived and died in obscurity, their names forgotten, their stories untold. They worked in fields and workshops, bore children who might never know their mother's origins, and endured daily humiliations that left no trace in the historical record. Their suffering was the foundation upon which Viking prosperity was built. The psychological toll of this displacement was immense and often permanent. Even captives who eventually gained their freedom struggled with what we would now recognize as trauma. They had nightmares about the raids that had torn them from their families. They startled at unexpected sounds that reminded them of war cries and burning buildings. They carried deep scars that never fully healed. Some developed what medieval sources described as melancholy or madness, conditions that made them unsuitable for most forms of work. Others became withdrawn and silent, performing their duties mechanically while retreating into internal worlds that their masters couldn't penetrate. A few became violent, lashing out at other slaves or even attempting to harm their captors despite the severe punishments that such actions would bring. The children of captives often inherited these psychological wounds. They grew up hearing whispered stories about distant homelands they would never see. They learned fragments of languages they would never speak fluently. They carried cultural memories that made them perpetual outsiders in their birth communities. Some spent their entire lives searching for connections to identities that had been severed before they were born. Yet these displaced populations also became sources of cultural innovation and exchange. They brought new techniques for farming, crafting, and cooking to their adopted communities. They introduced different approaches to music, storytelling, and religious practice. They served as living bridges between cultures that might otherwise have remained completely separate. The influence of captive women on Viking culture was profound, but often unacknowledged. They taught their masters' children to speak foreign languages. They prepared exotic foods that gradually became part of local cuisines. They shared medical knowledge that saved lives and crafting techniques that improved everyday objects. Their cultural contributions were absorbed and naturalized until their foreign origins were forgotten. This cultural blending created hybrid identities that were neither fully Viking nor fully foreign. Second and third generation descendants of captives developed their own traditions that combined elements from multiple cultures. They told stories that mixed Norse mythology with Irish folklore. They practiced religious rituals that blended Christian and pagan elements. They created art that reflected aesthetic influences from across the known world. The legal evolution of slavery in Viking societies reflected these changing cultural dynamics. Early laws treated slaves as simple property with no rights or protections. But as Christian influence grew and cultural mixing increased, new legal categories emerged. Some jurisdictions recognized different types of bondage with varying degrees of rights and restrictions. Others created pathways to freedom that hadn't existed in traditional pagan law. These legal changes didn't eliminate slavery, but they did create new possibilities for captives and their descendants. Some could earn freedom through years of faithful service. Others could purchase their liberty if they could accumulate sufficient resources. A few could gain freedom through religious conversion or marriage to free persons. The system became more complex and potentially more humane, though it remained fundamentally exploitative. The economic importance of slave labor began to decline as Viking societies became more settled and agricultural. Permanent farming communities needed fewer workers than the mobile raiding culture that had preceded them. Local populations grew and provided sufficient labor for most economic activities. The massive profits from long-distance raiding diminished as target communities developed better defenses and Christian kingdoms organized more effective resistance. By the 11th century, the great age of Viking raiding was coming to an end. The conversion of Scandinavian rulers to Christianity eliminated much of the religious justification for enslaving fellow Christians. The consolidation of European kingdoms created stronger military forces that could resist Viking attacks. The development of new trade routes reduced the profitability of human trafficking compared to other forms of commerce. But the human legacy of these centuries of displacement continued to shape European populations for generations to come. The genetic mixing that had occurred during the Viking Age created new population patterns that persisted long after the raids had ended. Cultural influences that had been introduced by captive women became permanent features of Scandinavian societies. Religious and artistic traditions that had emerged from cultural blending continued to evolve and spread. The descendants of captive women often retained fragmentary memories of their ancestral origins. Family stories passed down through oral tradition preserved information about homelands that had been lost centuries earlier. Genetic markers carried in their DNA told stories that written records had forgotten. Archaeological discoveries continued to reveal evidence of their presence in sites across the former Viking world. Modern DNA analysis has revolutionized our understanding of these population movements. We can now trace the genetic signatures of captive women in populations across Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and even Greenland. We can identify the specific regions where they originated and track how their descendants spread throughout the North Atlantic. We can see how their genes mixed with those of their captives to create the distinctive population profiles that characterize these regions today. This genetic evidence has forced historians to reconsider the scale and impact of Viking human trafficking. The numbers were clearly much larger than earlier estimates had suggested. The geographic scope was more extensive than anyone had imagined. The cultural and biological consequences were more profound and lasting than traditional historical methods had been able to detect. But genetics can only tell us so much about the human experience of captivity. The DNA in our cells carries no memory of the terror that accompanied displacement, the grief of separation from loved ones, or the daily struggles that defined life in bondage. Those stories have been lost to time, surviving only in fragments preserved in sagas, legal codes, and archaeological remains. What we can say with certainty is that the captured women of the Viking Age were not passive victims who disappeared without trace into historical oblivion. They were active agents who found ways to survive, adapt, and sometimes even thrive in circumstances that were designed to destroy them. They preserved cultural traditions, formed new communities, and created hybrid identities that enriched the societies they joined, willingly or otherwise. Their legacy lives on in the genetic heritage of millions of modern Europeans, in the cultural traditions that still shape Scandinavian societies, and in the archaeological record that continues to reveal new evidence of their presence and influence. They were the invisible architects of medieval European civilization, whose contributions have only recently begun to receive the recognition they deserve. The story of what happened to captured women after Viking raids is ultimately a story about human resilience in the face of systematic exploitation. It's about the ways that individuals and communities adapted to circumstances that were meant to erase their identities and reduce them to mere economic units. It's about the unexpected consequences of cultural contact, even when that contact was violent and non-consensual. Tonight, we've traced their journey from the moment of capture through the complex systems of trade and exploitation that distributed them across the medieval world. We've seen how some found ways to survive and even prosper, while others disappeared into the brutal machinery of human trafficking. We've explored the legal, religious, and cultural frameworks that shaped their experiences and the lasting impact they had on the societies they joined. Their stories remind us that history is never just about kings and battles and grand political movements. It's about individual human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control, making impossible choices, finding ways to endure when endurance seemed impossible. The captured women of the Viking Age were part of a vast historical transformation that reshaped the demographic and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. But they experienced it as personal tragedy, daily struggle, and sometimes unexpected opportunity. What strikes me most about their experiences is how they challenge our simple categories of victim and survivor, of destruction and creation, of ending and beginning. A woman torn from her Irish village might spend years in brutal captivity before eventually becoming the trusted advisor to a Norse queen. A Saxon girl sold in a Byzantine market might learn to read and write in Greek, skills that her original community never would have provided. A Slavic captive might find herself managing the household of a wealthy Icelandic farmer, wielding more practical authority than she ever could have imagined in her birth village. These weren't happy endings. They weren't redemption stories. They were survival stories, and survival often required compromises that we can barely comprehend from our modern perspective. Women who had lost everything learned to find meaning in small victories, in moments of kindness from unexpected sources, in the hope that their children might face better circumstances than they had. The archaeological record continues to reveal new details about their daily lives. Excavations of medieval households show evidence of cooking techniques that originated in distant lands, brought by captive women who adapted their traditional recipes to new ingredients and circumstances. We find grave goods that reflect hybrid cultural identities, combining Norse and foreign elements in ways that suggest complex processes of cultural negotiation and adaptation. Personal ornaments discovered in these sites tell particularly poignant stories. A Celtic brooch buried with a woman in Iceland, a Byzantine coin worn as a pendant in a Norwegian grave, a Slavic-style comb found in a Faroese settlement. These objects were more than mere possessions. They were connections to lost worlds, tangible links to identities that had been forcibly severed but never entirely abandoned. Some captive women found ways to maintain contact with their original communities, sending messages through traders or pilgrims who traveled the same routes they had been forced to take. Others created new forms of cultural expression that blended their ancestral traditions with the customs they had been forced to adopt. They told stories that preserved fragments of their original cultures while adapting them to new audiences and circumstances. The children and grandchildren of these women often became the most successful cultural mediators in medieval European societies. They spoke multiple languages natively, understood different legal and social systems instinctively, and could navigate between communities that viewed each other with suspicion or hostility. These skills made them valuable as translators, negotiators, and traders, but they also marked them as perpetual outsiders who belonged fully to no single culture. Religious conversion played a complex role in these processes of cultural adaptation. Some captive women embraced Christianity as a path to better treatment or social acceptance, while others maintained their original beliefs in secret. Many developed syncretic practices that combined elements from different religious traditions, creating personal spiritualities that reflected their complex cultural experiences. The conversion of Scandinavian societies to Christianity gradually changed the legal and social status of these women and their descendants, but the process was uneven and often contradictory. Christian law prohibited the enslavement of fellow Christians, but it also reinforced patriarchal structures that limited women's rights and opportunities. Some captive women found that conversion improved their circumstances, while others discovered that it simply replaced one form of subordination with another. So tonight, we've journeyed through one of history's darkest chapters, following the lives of women whose stories were nearly lost to time. We've seen how the Viking slave trade reshaped entire populations, how captive women became unwilling architects of cultural change, and how their descendants carry genetic memories of displacement that echo through the centuries. From the markets of Hedeby to the halls of Byzantine emperors, from Irish princesses who became Norse concubines to Saxon girls who learned to navigate foreign tongues, these women survived impossible circumstances and left legacies that modern science is only now beginning to understand. Their DNA flows through millions of Europeans today, proof that even in humanity's cruelest chapters, life finds ways to endure, adapt, and ultimately transform the very societies that sought to erase them. Some stories demand to be told, and tonight we've finally given voice to the voiceless.